Thank you all for joining us this morning for the fourth session of the Gender in Focus Dialogue series. Our earlier sessions had dealt with primarily questions around valuation of women's labor in sectors like agriculture and fisheries. And we've also conducted dialogues with the farmers themselves, women farmers, who shared their lived experiences and situated knowledge with us. Some of MSSRF's own field sites are located in regions that have seen shifts in the nature of interactions between agriculturalists and wildlife. Considering that around 75 to 80% of the work in agriculture is dependent on women's paid and unpaid labor, it is important to understand the gender dimensions of human-wildlife relations. And thank you, Dr. Meera Anna Oommen, for accepting our invitation to speak on this issue and help us make sense of these changing relations. Introducing Dr. Meera Anna Oommen. She is the Associate Director and Founder Trustee of Dakshin Foundation. She is also a trustee of the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust. She has over 25 years of experience conducting applied and basic research in conservation. Her work focuses on incorporating insights from multiple disciplines to understand conflicts in natural resource governance and conservation and their role in the generation of wicked problems. This includes understanding the dynamics of conflict with species such as elephants and wild pigs in forest fringe landscapes of the southern Western Ghats, as well as similar situations with saltwater crocodiles in the Andaman Islands. Meera's expertise lies in applying heuristics, satisficing approaches, and elements of bounded rationality to understand complex, uncertain systems involving multiple interacting components. Her current work also focuses on research at the interface of environmental history, anthropology, and ecology, and their interactions in the context of human-animal interactions, such as hunting, conflict, and resource use. This research, when integrated with human biology and behavior, also explores the motivations behind practices such as big game hunting and other gendered costly signaling strategies. Meera's geographical areas of expertise include the Western Himalaya and the Trans-Himalaya, the Western Ghats, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Her species of interest include wild boar, the Asian elephant, seawater crocodiles, and the Nicobar tree shrew. Today, she'll be speaking on the gender dimensions of human-wildlife relations, conflict, conservation, and sustainable use. Thank you, Meera, and over to you.
Thank you, Anamika. And I'm really honored to be able to present today. I'm especially glad to speak to fellow colleagues who work extensively in rural systems and in fisheries. As you may know, coastal and marine and island systems are also the focus area of Dakshin, which is my own organization. So I'm really happy to be here. So I have to start with a confession by saying that I'm not primarily a gender researcher. And even though it's an axis of paramount importance, I'm actually guilty of not looking at it at gender critically enough due to a focus on other themes and priorities and so on. And secondly, even when my work has focused on gendered practices, as in the case of my work on hunting, I've looked a lot at male hunting and male strategies. But what I wanted to say is that even when you're not looking specifically at gender, you can't really wish it away. It's a critical and often distinguishing variable that separates or explains various aspects of human behavior, practices, outcomes, and so on. And the same applies to human-wildlife relations. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to talk about how gender plays out in three interrelated fields that I work with currently. That is in wildlife conservation, in the hunting, harvesting, and use of wildlife, and finally in the emerging field of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. Some of the themes that I focus on today will also deal with male strategies and performative masculinity. as they provide a valuable contrast to that of women in these explorations. And although I won't go into very deep into any particular field due to constraints on time, I would like to pay attention to a few gender dimensions within each of the themes. I'll look at a few global examples. While looking at conservationists and scientists, I'll briefly examine how little women figure in conservation disciplines, and I'll also look a little bit at celebrity conservation. But I would like to focus again on the contribution of women from traditional societies and their practices and their role in contemporary wildlife conservation. For the second expression, I would like to take a brief look at where women are placed in the hunting and sustainable use spectrum by focusing on the long-standing man-the-hunter debate. And finally, I'd like to look at gendered patterns and relationships with respect to species that are involved in conflict. And this is informed by my own work in environmental history and anthropology, as well as recent contemporary perspectives from feminist political ecology. But before that, I wanted to highlight some recent research which has taken place at a very broad, looking at very broad scale differences in gender relations in human-animal relations as a whole, not just with wildlife, but animals as a whole. There is a recent paper by Hal Herzog, who's a psychologist, who's shown that indeed there are gender differences in attitudes towards the treatment of animals in terms of attachments to pets, involvement in animal protectionism, animal hoarding, hunting, animal abuse, bestiality, and so on. He puts forward the claim that on average, women show higher levels of positive behaviors and attitudes towards animals. That is, according to him, these are, like a reluctance to use animals, more involvement in animal protection, and so on. Whereas men typically have higher levels of negative attitudes and behaviors. That is, either they're involved in hunting or there might be more cases of animal abuse by men and less favorable attitudes to animal protection. I'm not really thrilled with the way he labels some of these behaviors as positive and negative. I think there's a lot of bias there, but nevertheless, there are differences in most of these areas. But he also points out that in most of these areas, there is also considerable overlap between men and women, with much greater within sex variation than between sex variation. I will talk about that maybe a little later. Coming to the role of women in conservation, usually when we are taught about the origins of modern conservation and conservationists and the pioneering conservationists, we are typically flooded with the names of men who are associated with the North American romantic conservation movement. These are very influential individuals like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Ansel Adams, and even people like Aldo Leopold and Theodore Roosevelt and so on, who were not diehard protectionists, but nevertheless had a significant influence as to where the discipline was, where conservation was moving. It's only somewhat much later, actually, that we come across names such as that of Rachel Carson. She was an aquatic biologist who actually showed environmental effect of pesticides such as DDT and so on on amphibians and so on. And she was also the author of the landmark publication Silent Spring. So what is being said is that the influence of some of these early and predominantly male conservationists, combined with existing colonial practices such as those of the removal of indigenous people from their lands, was instrumental in the development of a very strong exclusionary fortress conservation model, which was exported widely across the world and has come to be the norm even in places like India. And recently, researchers have even suggested that the intertwining of patriarchy with capitalism, colonialism, and militarism ensures that the benefits of power and privilege flow primarily to men. And feminists have pointed out that patriarchy privileges certain types of masculinity, that is through the erasure of emotional connection, suppression of empathy, by promoting detachment and prime men for violence. The claim is that patriarchy normalizes the objectification and the instrumentalization of nature, and thereby facilitating exploitation and destruction. And also that violence against human minority groups and animals are actually, are violent male practices. I do not share this particular viewpoint at all. While I agree that male domination and the dominance in conservation has been a long-standing pattern, and that there have been a range of problematic outcomes, attributing all the ills of conservation to patriarchy is somewhat unnuanced. And as I said before, some of these studies also easily see long-term practices such as animal use and hunting as simply black and white. These type of assumptions also naively assume that they attribute an absolute lack of agency to women, whereas in reality, women are not passive spectators, but are active participants. But needless to say, over the years, there have been a number of influential women in conservation, whether we are talking about individuals like Joy Adamson, who was an artist and a writer, and who went on to influence millions through her writing and subsequently the films. We have controversial celebrities like Brigitte Bardot, who in the 1970s lobbied against the harp seal commercial harvests by indigenous groups. It's been an ongoing battle between animal rights groups and others, including these guys who served a burger made out of seal meat and called it the Bardot burger. And she, of course, retaliated in an equally immature fashion by showing a human baby that has been clubbed to death by a harp seal, just illustrating that sometimes, women celebrities are sometimes drawn towards more animal rights positions. And then there are, like Rachel Carson, there have been researchers like Jane Goodall who studied chimpanzees for a long period of time, and more importantly, showed us that chimps and people are not so different after all. And primatology and primate conservation is an especially interesting detour here, because unlike a number of other conservation and scientific disciplines, there have been a number of very prominent women in this field. In fact, primatology has been called an equal opportunity discipline, alluding to the fact that it has almost 50% female representation, which is a lot compared to other science disciplines. And it's even been called a feminist science. And here in this photograph, you have the triumvirate of primatology, the late Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, and Birute Galdikas, who worked on gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans, respectively. So why are there so many women in this field? Do women make better primatologists? And quite a few reasons have been put forward. And first, and perhaps the most superficial one, is that women are perhaps picking cute and cuddly animals. But in fact, if you look at primates in some detail, we find that while they do look cute on the outside, just like humans, there's no dearth of violence among them. Many primates kill, rape, commit infanticide, and consume other animals. In fact, chimpanzees are even known to predate on infant humans. Another reason is that biology, psychology, and anthropology, the three parent disciplines of primatology, have considerably large numbers of women. And this might be the fact that primatology has so many women is a function of that as well. The other reason is that primatology is probably a young discipline, and which is not beset by patriarchal hierarchies, and attract a lot of women into the field. Others have attributed this to the Leakey effect. If you remember Dr. Louis Leakey, the Kenyan British paleoanthropologist and archaeologist, he mentored these three women and who in turn influenced further participation. There was a lot of coverage by National Geographic and other magazines about their work and invited more women to join this group. There are also explanations that deal with the fact that among primates, there's a preponderance of female bonded primate societies where females stay in the same group. And the fact that primate behavior might be giving insights into human behavior, and that women are more likely to take on disciplines that offer scope for, in interior change and improvement and so on, and are less likely to choose disciplines such as math, physics and chemistry and engineering, which deal with more hard abstractions. These are the viewpoints that have been put forward. The Indian conservation situation roughly follows the global one as far as gender representation is concerned. There have been a lot of alpha males and must bulls, as one of my colleagues put it, and a clear pattern of male researchers fishing down the food chain, fighting over lions, tigers, elephants, and so on, before moving on to smaller, less charismatic species. Most disciplines in conservation are still highly male-dominated, some more than the others. For instance, using the example of herpetology, that is the study of reptiles and amphibians, a recent evaluation of over 1,000 publications I think the last 70 years shows a very strong male bias. About 70% of the papers only had male co-authors. At the same time, although only few, Indian herpetology has been lucky to have some women, intrepid women herpetologists who've contributed immensely to conservation in the country. And I'm sure for most of you who are sitting in Chennai, this is not new. You'll be familiar with this person, Zai Whitaker, who, along with Romulus Whitaker, founded the Madras Crocodile Bank. And it was Zai's surveys in the Andaman Islands, which were the precursor to a lot of, field work and exploration in the islands. And also the establishment of field stations like the Andaman Nicobar Environment Team. Further, her work has been instrumental in imparting the joy of herping to young readers across the world. And when talking about women in reptile conservation in India, one name again stands out, that is of J. Vijaya, or Viji as she was known. She was instrumental in the rediscovery of the forest cane turtle, which was a rare species of turtle of which only 2 specimens had ever been described, had ever been recorded, and which had been missing from the records for over 70 years. So working with the tribal elder, Viji spent extended amounts of time in the Nadgani forest and rediscovered the species, started a captive breeding program at the Croc Bank. And not only that, her dedication towards chelonians took her across different parts of the country that were not particularly safe for anyone, such as the Chambal ravines and so on. And in the early 1980s, she also published an article with photographs on the mass slaughter of olive ridleys in Digha, where these turtles were meant for the Calcutta meat markets. And it's believed to have motivated Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister then, to call for urgent action for protection. But moving away from the glitzy side of conservation, while a lot is talked about conservationists and their relationships with wildlife or how they came about, we seldom pay attention to the gendered roles within communities that bring about positive conservation outcomes, that is within traditional communities. And a key axis of difference between indigenous conservationist relationships to land and the others is that of use of species and ecosystems. In many traditional societies, local communities, especially women, have been instrumental in the manipulation of the landscape and in the maintenance of often a richer level of biodiversity than otherwise would have been. And this has been shown to be true of several native landscapes. In North America, we have the work of William Cronon for New England and Kat Anderson, who documents this extensively for California. These are important contributions. Both point out that the abundance of game that was witnessed by the white settlers on their arrival was not a result of a pristine, untouched landscape, as was assumed, but the product of Native American manipulation of land. A very good contemporary illustration for this is the Australian context. So anthropologists Rebecca and Douglas Bird, who conduct a lot of the research on the Martu people in Western Australia, have shown that the women traditionally have this practice of setting small fires while foraging and hunting for different species, bustard, emus, kangaroo, and also the age-old practice of goanna hunting. Goannas are species of varanus, like our monitor lizard. And this practice results in a patchwork of landscape, in a patchwork kind of landscape that provides a perfect environment for threatened species like bilbies, wallabies, possums, and so on. But when this type of controlled burning was stopped, as it was many years ago, what happened was that the fuel load in terms of spinifex grass in these areas built up so much that if there was a lightning strike, very large patches of land were devastated. And so the Martu were cleared off their lands in the 1960s for some missile tests and so on. And until they won their territory back in the early 2000s, controlled burning was not carried out. And when they regained their title, the fire regime was rejuvenated again. And their practices protect the region from the devastating fires which used to happen. So as we know, knowledge about country, knowledge about fire, and knowledge about animals are part of the unique aboriginal cosmology of the dreaming, or the dream time, as it's called. And women are stewards of several streams of these forms of knowledge, practice, and performance. In marine systems also, similarly, women play a significant role. In one of my own organization's field sites, the Lakshadweep Islands, our sustainable fisheries team has documented and has been working with Appal Kuttal, or the traditional octopus fishery, which is carried out by women and children during the reefs, on the reefs during the low tide. It's a gleaning practice. Octopus are selectively harvested. The harvesters can ensure that females or juveniles are not harvested before breeding. Harvesting can be done without impacting reef health in any adverse fashion, and so on. And since the octopus is a fast-growing species, it's a relatively simple and effective renewable fishery which can be easily regulated. Related question that researchers such as us who work with local communities who sustainably utilize wildlife are often asked is, how can we support this kind of exploitation of wildlife? And I think the broader question to be asked here is, does the use of wildlife as an edible resource or for other purposes, does it impact conservation negatively in terms of the levels of biodiversity? And does that also negate positive bonds between people and wildlife? The answer to the first is already evident. As we saw before, indigenous land use and relationship with species has the potential to be sustainable if carried out right. And sometimes this can lead to better biodiversity outcomes. For the second, I will provide two gendered examples. So the first is that in parts of Amazonia, it's a common sight to see indigenous community members, especially women and young girls, carrying different species of monkeys, often on their shoulders or on their head. Usually this bond arises when the mother is hunted, leaving behind an orphaned baby. And the baby is often kept as a pet, and it is integrated with the family, uh, especially its new parent, who is likely to be a young girl or a woman. And Charlie Hamilton Jones, the National Geographic photographer who took these images, writes about this unique bond. And he says that despite the brutal start, the love and bond between people and their monkeys represents this deep relationship between indigenous people of the Amazon and their natural world. The second example relates to a community of ethnic Kazakhs settled in the Altai Mountains in Mongolia. They hunt using eagles. So female eagles, that is female golden eagles, and females make better hunters. They're taken from their nests, from their eyries when they're very small, and looked after by the hunters and trained, and a bond develops between the hunter and the eagle. And the eagles are used to hunt small prey, which are used for meat and fur. And these birds become an integral part of their families. It's believed that the Burkichi, or the hunters, in fact, prefer them to their wives. And for some of them, it's a very intense bond. And what's even more surprising is that after several years, the birds are released back into the wild again, and they seem to survive well on their own, because sometimes when the hunters are out again, they meet these birds again, and the eagles come to them. And only with about 50 or 60 such eagle hunters left, this seems to be a generation of, be almost the last generation of hunters, because most of the children are leaving for easier work in the cities, and hardly anyone wants to take this up. So this is a unique cultural practice that seems to be dying out in the wake of modernity. And more often than not, cultural practices such as this are viewed by urban conservationists as problematic and are criticized endlessly, either for taking young birds out of their nests, or more often the criticism is against the use of free-ranging wild species, or how humans are benefiting from such violence. There are accusations of disrespect to animal and so on. And it is an ongoing debate. The community, of course, swears by their love for the eagles and defend their ways of life. So when conservationists look at the different roles for wild species in relation to humans, we tend to look at this in black and white, between protection and destruction or exploitation, without looking at the middle ground and the case for multifaceted engagements, which can be separated along different axes, including sex and gender. And one of the controversial dimensions in that is, as I said, of hunting. A lot of my own work is on this topic, with a very, very long history that predates modern humans. Hunting is believed to have catalyzed human evolution through nutritional and provisioning benefits. It takes a range of forms, and in some of these, there are distinct gender differences. For instance, on average, though there are exceptions, men hunt bigger game, women hunt smaller animals, and do a lot of the foraging. In its most simplistic and naive form, this idea fueled the man the hunter debate in the late 1960s, in which male contributions to provisioning and masculine coded activities were considered central to human development. And stereotypically, these were exalted. At the same time, women's contributions as well as their agency were devalued. But this initial debate does a favor by triggering a huge range of explorations, which are really interesting from the perspective in the hunting of wildlife. And a key contribution here is the work of Kristen Hawkes, who's an anthropologist who has extensively studied the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. What she found was that while men did indeed spend a lot of time hunting, but were successful only a very small percentage of the time. Success rates of individual men were really low, a little over 3%. On the other hand, both women who were both young and old were responsible for securing the majority of calories for their families. This could be through hunting small game, digging up tubers, grubs, collecting honey, and so on. Basically, everyday foraging practices that were less uncertain than big game hunting and more productive for the family. Hawks also found another interesting thing. Once a woman had a second child, the amount of food that the grandmothers were collecting, not the mothers, the grandmothers were collecting, correlated to the well-being of the children. And so she then links this research to the grandmother hypothesis, which posits that the long menopausal stage in human females is an adaptation that is beneficial for long-term fitness. And the grandmother's contribution could be through providing food, contributing to childcare, through imparting knowledge, and so on. And we find that in many traditional societies as well as in modern ones, grandmothers play a key role. My own work shows that the general pattern of big game hunting by males still dominates. There's evidence for this right from the time of early hominids to anatomically modern humans and also contemporary communities, especially those who have made the transition from hunting and gathering to foraging to pastoralism, agriculture, and a range of modern occupations. And we view this form of hunting as a costly signaling strategy that could signal intrinsic quality to potential mates or competitors, or you could call it a hunting handicap or an arena for showing off in order to secure dominance, status, and prestige. And this was initially suggested by Professor Kristen Hawkes. This, however, doesn't mean that women don't or can't hunt. There are groups like the ACTA in the Philippines, the Simane in the Bolivian Amazon, and a number of others who take part in hunting while still more than adequately fulfilling their roles as mothers and caregivers. ACTA women are known to hunt pigs and deer using bow and arrows. The work by researchers like Madeleine Goodman and Vicky Reyes Garcia and all show that the dichotomy between men and women hunting and between male and female roles is not as great as previously assumed. That is among forager communities. But the difference is that women often hunt using strategies that maximize for success in different ways than men. For instance, women are known to carry out less solo hunting, preferring instead to go in groups. They prefer hunting using dogs and so on. And the emergence of, say, handheld tools such as the atlatl, which is shown here, it's a spear thrower, and it's been known to equalize the velocity of male and female launched objects. These kind of discoveries mean that women could have taken part more in big game hunting in prehistoric times. So there's more and more evidence which is being gathered to show that big game hunting among foragers saw broader participation from both females and males. So the attribution of deep history to a gender division of labor is quite a hotly contested topic now. And at this point, there are also a group of anthropologists who are increasingly trying, and I feel trying too hard to support the woman, the hunter argument. They use not only the case of early foragers, but also point out that there have been women warriors like the Dahomey Amazons who are shown here, who are very skilled in the use of edged weapons and skilled in hand-to-hand combat and so on. But others point out that women have been known to hunt and take part actively in war, but this is an exception rather than the rule. And when it comes to animals involved in conflict with people, however, it has been hunting by males that has really dominated. And often the destruction of so-called dangerous beasts and vermin was turned into a sporting activity, be it tiger hunts or elephant hunts, or pig sticking, which was a practice which was carried out in parts of northern India and so on. In the Indian subcontinent, during the colonial period, this form of engagement was extremely popular. Shikar was a pastime as well as a means of upward mobility for subaltern British officers. The prevailing belief was that hunters made good soldiers. The historian Karen Jones reminds us that hunting was a highly performative activity. Not only was masculinity played out in the field, so-called ridding the colonies of dangerous game and passing on subtle messages of dominance to native populations, the hunt was performed again through the export of trophies back to places like England, and also through the publication of Victorian hunting memoirs and so on. But unlike the colonial period and its obsession with dangerous game, in contemporary forms of conflict, there are also a range of patterns that can be separated along the lines of gender. Depending on the context, different stakeholder groups are at the receiving end of animal attacks and so on. Women, men, adolescents, children all have different risk profiles. And there are different gender differences in how conflict or coexistence is perceived, experienced, and even reconciled with. And the differences maybe also in terms of exposure and sexual division of labor. For instance, in my study area in the Andamans, most of the crocodile attack victims are males, because the men are the ones who go out fishing in the creeks and out in these in crocodile habitats. The same also applies to a large extent to elephant conflict. But if you look at a situation like in the Garhwal Himalaya, more women get attacked by the Himalayan black bears, which are found there in larger numbers. In fact, much of it is because women are the ones who are going out and gathering fodder and fuel wood, and and as a result, they get attacked. And patriarchy has a big role to play in this. Radhika Govindrajan, in her book Animal Intimacies, actually talks about the whole human-bear relations in a very interesting fashion, if you wanted to follow up on that. And women often perceive a greater risk from wildlife. If attacked, children and women have lower chances of survival in attacks by large animals and also by venomous species. There's a strong relation with body mass and survival. In attacks such as with species like bears, leopards, crocodiles, and so on, there's a lot of physical injuries. There's lacerations, soft tissue damage, disfigurement, amputations, and so on. And animal attacks are again life-changing, not just because from the perspective of physical injury alone, but also in terms of PTSD and mental health-related struggles. Conflict with wildlife, therefore, entails a number of hidden costs for marginalized groups that are lower in the social hierarchies, especially women. And I would like to illustrate this with two examples from that of India itself. One is tigers in the Sundarbans and elephants in Assam. So Bagh Vidhva, or tiger widows, are widows of women, of men who have been killed by tigers in the Sundarban. In most cases, the men went out into the forest to catch fish or catch crabs or harvest honey and so on, and fell victim to tigers. In 2016 alone, an enumeration which was carried out suggested that there were at least 3,000 such widows in the Sundarbans. And these women are considered by the families of men as well as the community as a whole as unholy or as ill omens. And in many cases, the in-laws end up blaming them for the death of their sons. This is in part reinforced by the Bon Bibi legend. As you may know, in this part of the world, Bon Bibi is considered the primary protector of the people and activities that are carried out in the forest. And the displeasure of Bon Bibi can be incurred in the form of attacks. And I'm describing this in a very simplistic manner. There's a wider and much more nuanced debate around it. But as far as the widows are concerned, it it plays out to be a very unfortunate situation. And Arabinda Chowdhury, who is the lead author on one of the papers on this particular issue, reports that there are two layers of stigma. The first relates to the sense of guilt, which is suffered by the widows themselves and by the psychological trauma associated with it. And the second, as this hand-drawn map indicates, tiger widows are often considered cursed. They're ostracized from society and expected to live in isolation from the rest of the community. So in a society where widows already have a low social standing and uncertain livelihood opportunities, the stigma associated with their husbands being killed by tigers is even more, and widowhood impacts all aspects of life. And my own work in Kerala on elephants also shows some of these patterns, that women are often at the receiving end of some of these kind of conflicts. This particular example, however, is from Assam. And a recent piece of work that illustrates this well is the exploration of human-elephant relations by Sayan Banerjee and Shalini Sharma. They use the analytical framework of feminist political ecology to explore and highlight the gendered vulnerabilities and impacts, how living with elephants can result in gendered knowledge about elephants, and how conservation interventions, especially the decolonized ones, can maybe respond better to some of these gender dimensions. And talking about gendered risks and vulnerabilities, they point out that there are spatial, temporal, and seasonal differences in the way men and women engage with elephant habitats. For instance, women interact more with elephants when they're collecting fodder, firewood, or water from forest areas, and also during the sowing period, since sowing is done by women, as opposed to men who come under attack from elephants largely while guarding crops at night or moving through the landscape at night. And restricted mobility and similar impacts also yield a lot of gendered responses. For instance, the presence of elephants in tea estates leads to disruption of work. The outmigration of men in these landscapes for better livelihoods makes some of the families as de facto women-headed, and women are saddled with the additional responsibility of having to continue working despite the presence of elephants. And there are several mental health impacts due to fear and chronic stress associated with elephant presence. But these interactions also translate to different forms of gendered knowledge and ways of coping. Banerjee and Sharma also observed that high levels of conflict are there, but elephants are still revered by women who seem to respect and empathize with the elephants, considering their mutual deprivation and lack of food. At the same time, this is also embroiled in further anxiety and alcoholism and all for men. The authors also found that despite gendered risks, vulnerabilities, impacts, and coping mechanisms, the conflict management responses remain predominantly masculine or male-oriented, such as driving elephants out of the fields or migrating out of the system. The authors also say that despite these dimensions, conservation responses are often one-sided. There's a need for place-based responses and a need to foreground gendered voices in both research and practice. And women need to be part of the decision-making bodies for conflict resolution and in formulating responses, especially in relation to their lives and livelihoods. So just to summarize, in the previous few slides, we looked at various ways in which gender is enmeshed in different dimensions of conservation, in sustainable use, and in conflict. But going back to some of Herzog's work that I mentioned at the beginning, a critical issue that could be unpacked further are the terms gender difference and sex difference. In some sections of the research community, there's an argument that gender difference results from socialization, whereas sex difference is more innate. In reality, however, factors responsible for male-female differences defy simplistic nature culture nature-nurture dichotomies. And as we know, behavioral and cognitive differences between males and females are the result of numerous forces that interact in complex ways. Keeping that aside, in terms of pragmatic action, there are a few things that perhaps we can focus on as a result, and at least as a start to ensure gender equitability and justice. The first would be to mainstream gender in these fields and to bring marginalized voices to the forefront. Typically, these are of women, but occasionally men too are left out of the picture. The first, and yeah, we have increasing gender representation within conservation, particularly as far as conservation biologists and conservation activists are concerned. But rural women's contributions to conservation are often ignored or unrecognized and often devalued and uncompensated. Very few women from these systems find a place in decision-making contexts, and this needs to be improved. A number of campaigns have taken cognizance of these issues, and there are formal campaigns in the offing, like what you see here on the screen. But whatever the challenges is, we need to find a voice for at least almost a half of humanity whose voices are often ignored. So I'll stop here and I can take questions.
Dr. Meera, I am okay, I'm not turning my video off. I was really intrigued and learned a lot from your presentation. One of my questions is, as somebody who's followed the conservation movement in the US, where there's been a lot of critiques by Black and Brown, basically like looking at how conservation in the US has historically been white, right?
Yes.
Like people like John Muir and others that you've talked about.
Yeah.
So allowing that analogy for India, how do we talk about, or are there frameworks to also look at the angles of caste and the Adivasi community in India, which is more engaged in wildlife or interacting with our wildlife? So could you speak to those dimensions a bit?
Yeah, so I would say that, I mean, of course, like the North American scenario is very starkly white. And the Indian scenario, if you ask, is a lot of the early prominent movers and shakers in conservation were either from a higher caste or upper class individuals. Adivasi communities, or even many of the other middle class individuals did not figure in any of the conservation debates in early conservation in India. It's not because they were not practicing, conservation, or it was not labeled as conservation, right? So if you look at the conservation movement in India, especially, it started with a lot of it started with the conservation of tigers and elephants and so on, and all the individuals involved in it were either from some of the erstwhile royal families or from the upper caste individuals in Tamil Nadu, and also very, very rich folks. So the debate on conservation reflects that, right? The exclusionary conservation model was very easily adapted to India. One, because it didn't involve local communities, and two, because it was already superimposed on existing princely reserves and spaces like that. Those kind of spaces already existed in India as well. As I said, the parallels would be with traditional societies who actually manage their resources very well in terms of conservation, if you call it conservation, and I think one should call it conservation. But we're not given any importance by our own naturalists and conservationists of that period. There's, I think, quite a bit of work on it by various individuals in India as well. Like, even if you look at Mahesh Rangarajan's work on the conservation history of India, he does talk about a lot of that. Karthik Shankar and I have also written a recent paper. It's called Cat Fights and Crocodile Tears. It looks at the trajectory of conservation, about how it was taken over by a certain group of individuals who pushed a very exclusionary agenda.
So these women, the people who are living around the forest, they want their livelihood because their life is dependent on these products which are collected from the.
Yeah.
And also, women go there into the forest because they want to collect firewood, firewood basically. So, what is the solution? Do we have any alternative for them? Because their livelihood is dependent on forest products, and then they some of the times they go because they wanted to collect some this water, not water, that firewood for their houses. So, especially women, they are affected by this problem. Can you suggest some solution?
Yeah, so I'll try and answer your question in two parts. One is in many of the forest areas, and I can think of areas like, say, Bilagiri Rangaswamy Hills, BR Hills, or in many parts of India where there are local, especially tribal communities living in the forests, they seem to have managed somehow to coexist quite effectively with wildlife without getting into too much conflict with them. I would also like refer to you Tarsh Tekekara's work, which again deals with this kind of issue as in terms of human-elephant relations. But talking about what can be done, I think it's very, very context specific. For instance, in a place like the Andamans where I work in, and where people have to go in and out, I frankly think there are too many crocodiles in some of these spaces. And so you may need to have some little amount of selective removal and things like that. In other places, you may want to have alternate livelihoods, but those we have this habit of not thinking through what that alternate livelihood solution is. And sometimes bringing new problems into a landscape by pushing something like one of the things which I heard of, like in Kerala, what they tried is instead of wild meat, they said, why don't we give start poultry farms around the forest fringes so that people can eat that instead of, and that causes a bunch of other problems. So whatever that particular solution is, we need to make sure that it is somehow in sync with what the local community wants. Small changes can be made in terms of, protecting certain spaces from wildlife. If it is along, for instance, a forest which has elephants or like larger wildlife, so in some restricted way, some kind of protective barriers can be made. But any livelihood solution that you apply there, one has to think if it is causing further problems or not. So I can't say like for a particular area, I mean, for in terms of generalities, whether what would be suitable or not. I would think that one has to sit with the community, have all stakeholders, especially women, because as you also say, and as we've seen, women tend to bear a different set of conflicts. The risk profile is different, and work together to arrive at what might work and try out a few different solutions.
Okay, thank you. Say that it's context specific, so you have to find out the solution locally.
Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Locally and inclusively as much as possible, because one of the issues that we face is sometimes the solution is imposed on us because somebody in the city sits and thinks that, okay, let's do this, and it may not really work.
So, I mean, I was interested to, understand more about, your, you had shared that there's this whole issue of mental health and anxiety, that this conflict, the changing nature of relationship between even the indigenous communities, which have traditionally, historically lived with animals, that has been changing, and Wayanad is a good case in point, right? I mean, in the last couple of months, we've seen many tribal individuals being attacked by the elephants, and that has changed the whole conversation into something very shrill about extreme arguments about should we cull elephants or should we completely, kind of create these barriers that completely close the interaction between the two species. And I'm sure like all of this is creating a lot of anxiety on both the species, but more particularly within the indigenous communities. Have you done any work on, or could you point us to any other work that looks at these challenges about mental health and live very close to conflict zones?
I think there's, in terms of very quantitative work on mental health in relation to conservation impacts, there's this work of Sami Saharan. There's this a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, not so recent, but which shows that people living in these kind of high conflict situations, what that the research group calls them conservation refugees, that there's like very significant impacts like telomere shortening and things. There's already like impacts in terms of lifespan, basically longevity, as far as living in such spaces is concerned. One of the ideas which one could think of is in terms of episodic versus chronic stress. This is work by Robert Sapolsky, who says that episodic stress, like the example which he uses is of a lion and a zebra in the savannah, right? He says why zebras don't get ulcers is because it's, when it's being chased, it's a very short, abrupt, episodic kind of event, whereas chronic stress creates a lot of other problems. Like in the case, it's very it's shown in other human contexts, right? Like if you're stressed for extended periods of time, this will result in both physical as well as mental health problems over the long period. And the same applies to living with, I would think the same applies living with wildlife populations as well. So the question, with respect to your question among tribal communities, so if you had, I would think if you allow tribal communities to live and practice their ways of dealing with conflict, I would think that it's likely that there would be much less stress involved. For instance, in the Nicobar Islands, again, you have the same species of crocodile in the Andamans and in the Nicobars, but the Nicobars, there's no conflict because local communities are allowed to take matters into their own hands and sometimes maybe remove a large crocodile out of the system. It doesn't mean that they will go out and kill everything. Usually it's done keeping other factors in mind as well. There's a bunch of work on eco-PTSD in relation to attacks by wildlife in the Sundarbans. I can dig out the references for you. I don't remember offhand. But in general, if you're also looking at Wayanad, there is the work of Daniel and Ursula Munster and their teams, which has looked in quite a bit of detail at elephant conflict in this area. And also Tash Tekekara's work might be relevant for the Wayanad landscape as well.
I guess it also matters what kind of species you're dealing with, right?
Sorry.
I was saying that it also matters what kind of species we are dealing with. Because elephants are charismatic and have some other cultural significance, but for a rhino, it could be completely different, right? So
so elephants, I think there's this paper by Nurit Bird David, which I think talks about the not the Kadar, but I think the one of the communities and how they consider two types of elephants. One they call Devaru, which is like there's reverence associated with those things. Others are just elephants, which are like involved in conflict. I would say wild pigs are also highly charismatic, if you ask me. I mean, although most people don't think that way, like they're my favorite species. But working with pigs is also, it's something very exciting in the sense that pigs are very quick learners. They're very intelligent, and they change their strategies according to what's happening in the landscape. And if there's if you introduce a bit of fear in the landscape, they disappear. Otherwise, they come and hang around, close by. So if you go to a national park or a sanctuary somewhere in southern India, like if you go to the forest rest houses and all, you see the wild boar standing right next to you, not bothered. Whereas in a place where there is a little bit of fear for them, for instance, if there's hunting in the landscape, you don't see them at all. And they change their strategies very, very like frequently and like quickly. So, yeah.
So the question is, in terms of a conversation, the presence of stakeholders like fishermen in the Adyar River in Chennai estuary paradoxically ensures the survival of the green spaces and keystone species like olive ridley. If not for their presence, that area would be taken away for development. Any work that shows the need to maintain human populations engaged in the forest for the sake of forests themselves.
I would think that like this early paper on Bharatpur, where, I mean, it's not entirely relevant to the question, but still somewhat tangentially important. There's this work, I think, by Michael Lewis on the whole idea of Bharatpur as a man-made landscape, right? The bird sanctuary was basically put in place because it had a large number of birds coming in, and there were and birds would the selling point was that this was a slightly open space, and where there was like some amount of I think I'm not sure what was extracted, but there was a lot of human presence, and people were either taking out fodder or something and so on. But when the conservationists at some point, I think the forest department decided to throw people out, and then you find that the bird numbers are decreasing. And again, because of that, I think they had to get people back in. So there are many examples of places where wildlife is surviving because of the people who are there practicing a certain type of lifestyle. I would think the BR Hills, again, is a fantastic example where the Soliga community has been there for many generations, and there are still tigers there. So if you look at some of the work in that context, I'm sure that there is, and I'm not thinking of a lot of examples, but of course there are examples of this kind which I can easily, pick up.
But so Meera, this is going to be on YouTube, so I'm sure there are going to be a lot more people coming back to you with questions.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for doing this for us. We're also grappling with some of these issues because, as I said, some of our field sites are witnessing changes, and so we're also concerned about how the communities and the wildlife there coexist. So, if there are any work that we plan in future, we definitely would like to get in touch with you for your guidance. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for participating. And I think the introduction, the mail that you've received, we have Meera's website's link on it. So please visit that. She's done some amazing work. And I think you also have your email ID on the website.
Yeah. So, please feel free to contact me if there's anything, I can, help with or discuss. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Meera. And thank you, everyone.
Ramika. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.